Before the story begins, ask yourself one question. How much would you trust your own brother? Because if someone had asked me that question 10 years ago, the answer would have been simple: with my life. And that was exactly the mistake that destroyed it. My name is Corwin Hale, and the worst day of my life started with a phone call I almost ignored. The number wasn't saved in my contacts. Unknown caller. 3 words that usually meant spam, insurance sales, or someone trying to sell me something I didn't need. The phone rang twice, then stopped. A second later, it rang again. Something about that bothered me. Most scammers didn't call back immediately. Standing in the warehouse office of Hale Agricultural Supply, I picked up. "Hello?" A woman's voice answered. "Mr. Hale?" "Speaking." There was a brief pause, the kind they take when they're deciding how to deliver bad news. "I'm calling from St. Vincent Medical Center." Every muscle in my body tightened. "My father?" I asked immediately. "Yes, sir." The room seemed to shrink around me. Dad had suffered a stroke 3 years earlier. He'd recovered surprisingly well, but since then, every hospital call carried the same fear. The fear that the next one would be the last. "Is he okay?" "I'm sorry, Mr. Hale. You should come as soon as possible." The line went silent. No details, no explanation, just those words: "You should come as soon as possible." I was already grabbing my keys before the call ended. The drive took 23 minutes, the longest 23 minutes of my life. Dad was 72. Stubborn, sharp-minded, hard-working, the kind of man who believed a handshake meant more than a contract, the kind of man who built a business from nothing, the kind of man who spent 40 years teaching his sons that family came before everything, especially family, especially blood. By the time I reached the hospital, my younger brother was already there. Brennan Hale, 41 years old, neatly dressed, calm. Too calm. At the time, I didn't notice. Later, I would replay that moment hundreds of times. The signs had already been there. I just wasn't looking. He stood when he saw me. "Corwin, what's happening?" His eyes lowered briefly. "Dad's gone." The words hit harder than any punch. For a moment, I couldn't hear anything, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The hallway blurred. A nurse walked past. Someone pushed a wheelchair. Life continued around me while mine stopped completely. Gone. Just like that, Dad was gone. Brennan placed a hand on my shoulder. "Come, sit down." But I couldn't. I stood there staring at the hospital floor, remembering all the things I should have said, all the conversations I thought we'd have later, all the time I believed it was still available, and then it wasn't. The funeral took place 4 days later. Hundreds attended: farmers, business owners, employees, friends, people whose lives Dad had helped for over 4 decades. The church overflowed. The parking lot overflowed. Stories filled the air. Stories about Dad's loans he had quietly given, families he had helped, jobs he had created, lives he had changed. Listening to those stories made me proud. It also made me realize how impossible it would be to replace him. After the service, Brennan and I stood together greeting guests, like brothers, like family, like the sons Dad had raised. Neither of us knew that before the month ended, we'd become enemies. At least that's what I believed then. The truth was much worse. 3 weeks after the funeral, attorney Victor Lang requested a family meeting. Nothing unusual. Dad had an estate, property, investments, the business. There were legal matters to settle. Brennan and I arrived at the attorney's office that Friday afternoon. Victor had worked with our family for nearly 20 years. His expressions seemed unusually tense. That should have been my second warning. The first had been Brennan's calmness at the hospital. The second was Victor's discomfort. At the time, I missed both. We sat down. Victor folded his hands. Your father updated his estate documents approximately 8 months ago. 8 months. I frowned. Dad never mentioned that. Not unusual, but not typical either. Dad discussed almost everything, especially business matters. Victor opened a folder. The estate will be distributed according to these documents. Brennan sat silently beside me, not nervous, not curious, just waiting. Again, I didn't understand what that meant. Then, Victor began reading, and the world changed. The family home transferred to Brennan. Dad's investment accounts transferred to Brennan. The lake property transferred to Brennan. The commercial properties transferred to Brennan. Nearly every significant asset transferred to Brennan. At first, I thought there had been some mistake, a clerical error, wrong paperwork, wrong file, wrong family. Then Victor finished, and silence filled the room. I stared at him. That's it? Victor looked uncomfortable. There are additional provisions. What provisions? He swallowed. The warehouse and operational business assets are assigned to you. I blinked. The warehouse? Not ownership, not company shares, not the company itself, just operational assets, equipment, inventory, responsibilities, debt. Mostly debt. My stomach dropped. Dad's estate had been divided so unevenly that it barely made sense. Brennan received wealth, I received obligations. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then I looked at my brother. Brennan? He avoided my eyes. That was the moment fear appeared. Not anger, not confusion. Fear. Because Brennan wasn't surprised, not even a little. Victor continued carefully. There's also a letter. He handed me a sealed envelope. Dad's handwriting covered the front. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single page. I read it twice, then a third time, because the words refused to make sense. Corwin, some decisions hurt more than others. One day you may understand why this had to be done. Trust that everything happened for a reason. Your father. That was it. No explanation, no details, nothing.
A lifetime of love reduced to 20 words. I looked up. Dad wrote this? Victor nodded. Yes. Why? I don't know. Victor sighed. I asked him the same question when he updated the documents. My eyes lifted. And? He told me the letter would make sense eventually. Victor shook his head. I never understood what he meant. Something cold settled in my chest. Dad wasn't a vague man. He wasn't mysterious. He explained things, always. This letter explained nothing. It felt wrong. Every instinct screamed that something wasn't right. But grief clouds judgment, and grief was still sitting heavily on my shoulders. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Looking back, one detail stands out. Victor seemed just as unsettled as I was. He read every document exactly as written, but several times he paused as though he expected an explanation that never came. At the time, I assumed he was simply uncomfortable. Later, I realized he was struggling to understand Dad's decisions too. Outside the office, Brennan tinily spoke. Corwin. What happened? His jaw tightened. What do you mean? You knew. His eyes widened slightly. Not enough, just enough. The reaction of someone caught off guard, not someone falsely accused. You knew about this. No. The answer came too fast, too clean, too prepared. No, I didn't. For a long moment we stared at each other, brothers, blood, family, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure whether he was telling the truth. That uncertainty haunted me all weekend. Then Monday arrived, and everything got worse. Far worse. The call came from the company accountant.
Her voice sounded shaken. "Corwin, have you looked at the financial records?" "No." "I think you should." An hour later, I sat in her office reviewing statements. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then patterns emerged. Transfers, large transfers, repeated transfers, amounts that didn't belong, amounts that shouldn't have moved, amounts that had moved anyway. My pulse accelerated. Where did this money go? The accountant slid another document toward me. A legal transfer authorization. Signed, approved, processed. My eyes froze on the signature line because it carried my father's name. Yet something felt wrong, very wrong. Dad's signature had always slanted slightly upward. This one didn't. Dad always crossed his T's aggressively. This one barely crossed them at all. I looked at the accountant. When did this happen? She swallowed. Over the last 7 months. 7 months. Almost exactly the same period during which Dad changed his will. The room became unbearably quiet. Then I noticed another detail. A detail so small, most people would have missed it. But Dad taught me bookkeeping when I was 16. He taught me to notice everything. The receiving account holder's name. My throat went dry, because the money hadn't gone to some vendor or investment account or business partner. It had gone somewhere else entirely, somewhere much closer, somewhere impossible. The account holder listed on the transfers was Brennan Hale, my brother, the same brother who had just inherited nearly everything. The same brother who claimed he knew nothing? The same brother who hadn't seemed surprised when Dad's estate was read. A terrible possibility began forming in my mind, one I desperately wanted to reject, one I prayed wasn't true. But before I could speak, the accountant handed me one final document, and when I saw the date printed across the top, every hair on my arm stood up, because the authorization had supposedly been signed by my father 2 days after he had already been admitted to the hospital and lost the ability to write. And suddenly there was only one question left. If Dad couldn't have signed it, then who did? The document remained in my hands long after the accountant stopped talking. A date, a signature, a transfer. 3 simple things, yet together they formed a question that refused to leave my mind. If Dad couldn't physically sign that authorization, who had? The accountant leaned forward. "You look pale." I barely heard her. My thoughts were racing, trying to find another explanation, a reasonable explanation, a harmless explanation, because the alternative was unthinkable. Not just theft, not just fraud. Family. Dad's own son. My brother. "No one else noticed this?" I finally asked. She hesitated. "I wasn't handling the accounts directly then." "Who was?" "Your father." That answer only deepened the problem. Dad managed the finances personally until the stroke complications worsened. He trusted very few people with company money. Almost nobody. Almost. One person. Brennan. My younger brother had worked beside Dad for years. He had access, knowledge, authority, everything needed to move money without attracting attention. Still, suspicion wasn't proof. Dad taught me that. Facts mattered. Evidence mattered. Assumptions destroyed families. Unfortunately, evidence was beginning to appear, and every piece pointed in the same direction. I left the accountant's office carrying copies of every suspicious transaction. 23 transfers, 7 months, more than $800,000. Not enough to bankrupt the company, enough to cripple it, enough to explain why the recent cash flow had been tighter than expected, enough to explain several strange decisions Dad had made during his final year, decisions I had questioned, decisions that suddenly looked very different. Driving home, memories surfaced one after another. Little moments, small conversations, tiny details that seemed meaningless at the time. Now they felt connected. 6 months earlier, Dad had canceled plans to purchase a neighboring property. He claimed the timing wasn't right. 3 months later, he refinanced one of the company's commercial buildings. That surprised everyone. The business had always been financially stable. Dad hated unnecessary debt, yet he'd taken on more. At the time, he brushed off my concerns. "We'll be fine." Those were his exact words. "We'll be fine." Not because things were fine, because he was trying to make them fine. The realization made my chest tighten. What if Dad already knew? What if he had discovered money was disappearing? What if the changes to the estate weren't rewards? What if they were damage control? The thought followed me all evening, and it followed me the next morning when I drove to Brennan's house. His SUV sat in the driveway. He was home. Part of me wanted to turn around. Once accusations started, there would be no going back. Once trust is broken, it never returns whole. But too many questions demanded answers. I knocked. Brennan opened the door. His expression changed the moment he saw me. Not surprise, concern, as though he already knew why I was there. That bothered me immediately. "We need to talk." He stepped aside. "Come in." The house was beautiful, far more expensive than it should have been, at least based on the salary I knew he earned. The thought struck me instantly, and once it appeared, I couldn't ignore it. The marble countertops, the luxury furniture, the renovations, the new appliances, had they always been there, or had I simply never paid attention? We sat across from each other. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, I placed the documents on the table. His eyes dropped to them, then rose again. "What are those?" "You tell me." Silence. "Brennan." His jaw tightened. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" I slid the transfer records toward him. He scanned the first page, then the second, then the third. His face revealed almost nothing. Almost, but I saw it. The brief flicker. Fear. Gone within a second, yet it had been there. "These accounts belong to you. They're investment accounts, funded by company money." "No." The answer came instantly, too instantly. I leaned forward. "Then explain it." He looked away. For the first time since Dad's death, I saw genuine discomfort. Not grief, not frustration, discomfort, and that terrified me. Because innocent people usually had explanations. Brennan didn't. Instead, he stood, walked to the kitchen, poured himself water, bought time. The longer he remained silent, the worse everything felt. Finally, he returned. "There are things you don't understand." Those 6 words changed everything. Not because of what they said, because of what they didn't say. He didn't deny receiving the money. He didn't deny the accounts existed. He didn't deny the transfers. "There are things I don't understand?" I repeated. "Yes." "Then help me understand." Another long silence. Then he surprised me. "Dad wasn't who you thought he was." The sentence hit me like a slap. "What?" "You heard me." "No." I shook my head. "No, don't do that. I'm telling you the truth." "You're blaming Dad?" His eyes hardened. "I'm saying you only saw one version of him." Anger began rising inside me, not because I believed him, because I didn't. Dad wasn't perfect, nobody was, but this felt different. This felt calculated, like someone trying to redirect attention, like someone trying to change the story. "You're saying Dad transferred $800,000 to you?" Brennan remained silent. "Answer me." "Some of it." The room spun, not because he admitted it, because he admitted it so casually. As though it weren't a massive betrayal. As though it weren't company money. As though it weren't the business Dad spent his life building. "You stole it." "No." His response came sharply. "I didn't steal anything." "Then what would you call it?" His eyes met me. For the first time, I saw anger there. Real anger. Years of it, buried deep. "I would call it repayment." The word landed between us. Repayment. For what? Dad had provided everything: education, jobs, opportunities, support. The idea made no sense, and yet Brennan looked completely serious. Repayment for what? His mouth opened, then closed. For a moment it looked as though he might finally say something. I learned something about our family. What? His eyes drifted toward the window. Something that changed everything I thought I knew. What are you talking about? He shook his head. If I tell you now, you'll think I've completely lost my mind. Try me. A bitter laugh escaped him. Not yet. The answer frustrated me, but it was the first time Brennan hinted that this wasn't really about money. The frustration nearly broke me. That's it? Brennan looked away. For now. $800,000 disappeared. I know. Dad changed his will. I know. You're connected to both. His silence answered for him. I stood. Every instinct told me he was hiding something enormous, something bigger than money, something bigger than inheritance, something that terrified him. Before leaving, I asked one final question. When did Dad first find out? His face froze. A tiny reaction, small but unmistakable, and in that instant, I received my answer. Dad had known. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to change the will, enough to alter the future of the family, enough to force some kind of decision. The drive home felt endless. The more I thought about it, the less the pieces fit. If Dad discovered financial misconduct, why leave almost everything to Brennan? Why reward him? Why weaken my position? Why write that strange letter? Nothing made sense. The next breakthrough came 3 days later, and it arrived from somewhere completely unexpected. Dad's former nurse. Her name was Elise Warren. She had cared for him during rehabilitation after the stroke. We met for coffee because she said there was something important I needed to know, something she'd wrestled with ever since Dad's death. She looked nervous, very nervous. After several minutes, she finally spoke. Your father was worried. The statement shocked me. Dad wasn't the type to scare easily. Worried about what? She hesitated, then lowered her voice. Someone was pressuring him. My pulse quickened. Who? I don't know. What do you mean? He never gave a name. The disappointment hit immediately. Then she continued, but he said something I'll never forget. I leaned forward. What? Her eyes met mine. If anything happened to him, the truth was hidden where nobody would think to look. The cafe suddenly felt too quiet. What truth? He wouldn't tell me. My heart pounded. Did he leave anything? Documents? Notes? She slowly nodded and reached into her purse. What she removed wasn't a letter. It wasn't a document. It wasn't a notebook. It was a key, a small brass key attached to a faded tag. I stared at it. What is that? Your father asked me to give this to you if he died before speaking with you. There was one more instruction, Elise said. I looked up. He told me that if I couldn't reach you, I was to contact attorney Victor Lang immediately. My pulse quickened. He planned for that too? Elise nodded. Your father wasn't leaving anything to chance. The world seemed to stop. Dad had planned for this, not hoped, planned, as though he believed there was a real chance he wouldn't get the opportunity himself. I took the key. The faded tag contained only 6 handwritten words. No address, no explanation, no instructions. Just 6 words. The old place beneath the mill. My breath caught, because I knew exactly what that meant. There was only one mill, an abandoned grain mill on family land outside town, a place nobody had used in nearly 20 years, a place Dad hadn't mentioned in over a decade, and suddenly memories flooded back. childhood summers, hidden storage rooms, underground maintenance tunnels, locked compartments, places forgotten by almost everyone, including Brennan. At least, that's what I believed at the time. That evening, I drove there alone. The sun was already setting when I arrived. The old structure stood exactly as I remembered, weathered, silent, half consumed by time. The key fits a rusted door near the foundation, a door hidden beneath years of overgrown weeds. The lock clicked. My hands trembled. Slowly, I opened it. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. At the bottom sat a single metal cabinet. Nothing else. Just one cabinet, one lock, one secret. The brass key opened that lock too. The door creaked. Inside was a thick manila folder, and on top of it rested an envelope. My name was written across the front in Dad's handwriting. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. Then I opened the envelope. The letter inside began with words that instantly drained the blood from my face. Corwin, if you're reading this, then Brennan has already lied to you. My hands started shaking. The next line was worse, much worse, because it answered a question I hadn't even known to ask, and it revealed a secret capable of destroying everything our family believed about itself. A secret Dad had hidden for more than 40 years. The letter began, "Brennan is not your brother." For several seconds, the words stopped making sense. Brennan is not my brother. The sentence remained on the page, unmoving, unchanging, impossible. My eyes read it again, and again. The letters never changed. The meaning never changed. Brennan wasn't my brother. The realization felt absurd. 41 years of shared birthdays, shared holidays, shared family photographs, shared memories. Yet Dad's handwriting sat in front of me, insisting that everything I believed was wrong. My hands trembled as I continued reading. Corwin, before you judge anyone, you need the full truth. 42 years ago, a man named Russell Keene worked for me. He was intelligent, ambitious, and dangerous. At first, I trusted him. That trust nearly destroyed our family. I swallowed hard. The name meant nothing to me. Dad continued. Russell managed several financial operations during the early years of the company. Over time, he began stealing from clients and hiding losses through fraudulent records. When I discovered what he was doing, I reported him. He lost his career, he lost his reputation, and he swore revenge. A cold feeling settled in my chest. The letter continued. Several years later, Russell disappeared from town. I believed the matter was over. I was wrong. Very wrong. I kept reading. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Brennan was Russell's biological son. I lowered the page. The underground room felt smaller, harder to breathe in, harder to think in. Dad's words continued relentlessly. Russell died in a vehicle accident when Brennan was an infant. His wife died shortly afterward. The boy had no family willing to care for him, no support, no future, no one. Then came the revelation that broke my heart. Your mother wanted to help. Against my better judgment, we adopted him. Officially, legally, completely. From that day forward, he became our son. The silence around me felt overwhelming. Dad and Mom had never treated Brennan differently. Not once. Not ever. Everything I remembered confirmed that. The baseball games, family vacations, Christmas mornings, school graduations. He'd been loved, fully, completely, without conditions. So why had any of this happened? The next pages finally answered. For years, Russell's past remained buried. Then, approximately 8 months ago, someone contacted Brennan. Someone who knew the truth. someone who knew exactly who his biological father had been, someone who convinced him that I had ruined his family's life. My pulse accelerated. Everything was beginning to connect. The timing, 8 months. During the same period, Dad changed the will. During the same period, money started disappearing. During the same period, everything began unraveling. I turned a page. Brennan confronted me after learning the truth. He believed I had destroyed his father. He believed I stole his inheritance. He believed his entire life was built on a lie. No matter what evidence I showed him, he refused to listen. The grief hit unexpectedly, because suddenly I could see it. Brennan discovering his identity, questioning everything, feeling betrayed, feeling manipulated, feeling robbed. And then someone whispered poison into his ear. Someone is feeding anger. Someone is feeding resentment. Someone is waiting decades for revenge. Dad continued. I eventually discovered who contacted him. Russell's younger brother, Malcolm Keene. The name meant nothing to me, but clearly it meant everything to Dad.
Malcolm had spent decades blaming our family for Russell's downfall. He convinced Brennan that I had fabricated evidence against his father. He convinced him that our family wealth rightfully belonged to him. And worst of all, he convinced Brennan that revenge was justice. I closed my eyes. The pieces finally fit. Not perfectly, but enough. Brennan hadn't stolen money out of greed. He believed he was reclaiming something Malcolm convinced him had been stolen decades earlier. It didn't excuse what happened, but it explained it. Dad's final pages revealed the hardest truth of all. When I discovered the missing money, I chose not to involve law enforcement immediately, not because Brennan was innocent, because he was my son, just as much as you. I hoped I could save him before he destroyed himself. The words hit harder than anything else. Dad knew. Dad knew everything, and even then he tried protecting Brennan, protecting both of us. I continued reading. The estate changes were never intended as a reward. They were leveraging. I transferred assets into Brennan's control because Malcolm's group was pressuring him financially. If they believed Brennan had already secured the inheritance, they would stop pushing him deeper. I needed time. Time to gather evidence, time to expose Malcolm, time to save our family. I also kept the truth from you for a reason, Corwin. I knew that if you discovered what Brennan was doing before I had proof of Malcolm's involvement, you would go straight to the police. And if that happened, Brennan would be arrested before I had any chance to pull him away from the people manipulating him. I was trying to stop a crime, but I was also trying to save my son. Perhaps that was my greatest mistake, or perhaps it was the last thing a father could do. But my health failed before I finished. The letter ended with one final instruction. Inside this cabinet are documents proving that Russell committed the crimes he was accused of. There are also recordings, financial records, and correspondence identifying Malcolm's involvement. Show Brennan everything. That was Dad's final instruction.
I considered leaving copies with Victor Lang. In the end, I chose not to. During the past year, I learned that Malcolm had contacts in places I never expected. Maybe I was being overly cautious. Maybe I was becoming paranoid. But I trusted very few people by then. The fewer people who knew where the evidence was hidden, the safer it remained. Then, let him choose who he wants to be. My son or Russell's revenge. Love always, Dad. The room fell silent. I stared at the cabinet. Inside sat decades of evidence, files, audio recordings, financial records, truth. The truth that Dad died trying to preserve. For nearly an hour, I reviewed everything. By the time I finished, there was no doubt left. Russell had been guilty. The evidence was overwhelming. Dad hadn't framed anyone. Dad hadn't stolen anything. The entire foundation of Brennan's anger had been built on lies, carefully constructed lies. 40 years of resentment handed down from one generation to the next. I left the mill after midnight and drove straight to Brennan's house. His lights were still on. He opened the door, looking exhausted. Then he noticed the folder in my hands. Every trace of color left his face. "You found it." Not a question, a statement. "You knew about this place." He nodded slowly. "Not until recently." I entered without waiting for permission. The folder landed on the table between us. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, I asked the question that mattered. "Did you know Malcolm lied about your father?" His eyes closed. That reaction told me everything. Not surprise, not confusion, recognition. "I found out 2 months ago." The words landed heavily. "What?" Tears appeared in his eyes, the first genuine tears I'd seen since Dad died. "I found out Malcolm lied." Anger surged through me. "You knew?" "Yes." "You knew and you kept going?" His shoulders sagged. The answer came out barely above a whisper. "I didn't know how to stop." His voice cracked. By then, Malcolm controlled too much. I stared at him. He had access to the accounts. He had records of everything I'd done, every transfer, every document. Brennan swallowed hard. He told me that if I turned against him, he'd make sure I took the entire fall alone. The room fell silent. "I know that's not an excuse," he continued. "I know I should have come forward anyway, but every day I waited, it became harder." For the first time, I understood the trap he had fallen into. Malcolm had spent months feeding his anger, months of encouraging revenge, months of helping him justify every decision. By the time the truth emerged, Brennan had already crossed too many lines. Admitting he was wrong meant admitting he'd betrayed the only family that ever loved him. Some people can survive that realization. Others break beneath it. Brennan looked broken. "I wanted to tell Dad." His voice cracked. "I tried." "When?" "The week before he died." The room went silent. Dad knew. Of course he knew.
He always knew more than he admitted. Brennan wiped his eyes. "He wouldn't let me apologize." "What?" "He said apologies could wait." I stared at him. What did he mean? A painful smile appeared. "He said actions mattered more." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Brennan reached into a drawer and removed a thick envelope. "I've been preparing this." Inside were transfer documents, property deeds, account statements, everything. Every dollar, every asset, every transfer, being returned, legally, completely. I looked at him in disbelief. Why? A tear rolled down his cheek. Because Dad was right. The answer sounded simple, yet it carried years of pain, years of guilt, years of regret. For the first time since the funeral, I saw not a thief, not a traitor, not an enemy, just a man who had allowed grief and anger to consume him. A man is finally facing the consequences. The legal process took months. Some assets were recovered, others weren't. Malcolm Keene was eventually arrested after investigators reviewed the evidence Dad had hidden. Several financial crimes were linked directly to him. The revenge he'd spent decades planning,
ended with prison bars closing behind him. As for Brennan, the relationship didn't magically heal. Real life doesn't work that way. Trust doesn't return because someone says sorry. Trust returns one decision at a time, 1 year at a time, one act at a time, slowly, painfully, honestly. 3 years later, we're still rebuilding. Some scars remain. Maybe they always will. But something Dad understood better than either of us is that family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by choices. Brennan wasn't born a Hale, but Dad chose him every day for more than 40 years. And in the end, Brennan finally made a choice too. Not revenge, not bitterness, not lies. Family.
The same choice Dad spent his entire life hoping he'd make. Sometimes people ask what the greatest inheritance Dad left behind was. It wasn't the business. It wasn't the properties. It wasn't the money. It was the truth. Because the truth saved our family when everything else nearly destroyed it. And every time I walk past Dad's photograph hanging in the office, I remember the final lesson he taught both of his sons. A lie can survive for decades, but eventually, the truth comes looking for it. And when it does, nothing remains hidden forever. Before you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think about this story? Did Brennan deserve forgiveness after everything he did? Or would you have made a different choice if you were in Corwin's position? And tell me something else. Where are you watching from today? I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and meeting people from different parts of the world. If this story touched you, moved you, or kept you listening until the very end, please take a moment to leave a comment below. Your thoughts, opinions, and experiences help make this community stronger. And if you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe to Unspoken Revenge Stories and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Most importantly, thank you for being here. Life isn't always easy. Many of us carry wounds that nobody can see. Some are healing from betrayal, some are rebuilding trust, and some are simply trying to make it through another day. No matter what you're facing, I hope this channel can be a place where you feel understood, welcomed, and never alone. Remember, every person has a story that remains unspoken. Until next time, take care of yourself, take care of the people you love, and thank you for being here.